Welcome back to the 706 podcast, the podcast where we, the four movie fiends, take a look at a movie and decide whether it's one of the 706 greatest movies of all time. My name is Connor. Here is my card, Bone. The font is called Cillian Rail. I'd like to introduce my co-hosts. How about Kirk?
Hey folks, my name's Kirk. My card is actually printed on an Egyptian papyrus. The ink is a muted fuchsia, imported from the Sichuan province of China, and the lettering is in a font called Davidian Massive.
Impressive, Kirk. Very impressive. And how about Tony?
Hello, I'm Tony. Eggshell and Comic Sans, actually.
Comic Sans, interesting choice. Interesting choice, Tony. Last but not least, the man of class, taste, and distinction. I'm very hyped for his card. How about Anthony?
Anthony, and it's in a papyrus, and I just cut out small little colored paper that I have left over from elementary school and hand that out.
Oh my God, the throwback. Very, very tasteful, Anthony. Well, thank you. Guys, of course, we are watching the year 2000's film, American Psycho, starring Christian Bale, directed by Mary Harron, written by Mary Harron and Guinevere Turner. Those are basically the relevant people I will be discussing. Obviously, movies are made by many more people, but those are the three figures. Obviously, this is a movie that kind of we think of as being very distinct for Christian Bale, and obviously kind of makes this movie, obviously playing Patrick Bateman, who I suppose is the titular American Psycho, right? This is sort of the confession of a serial killer who by day is a, kind of Wall Street stockbroker, yuppie type, kind of the incarnation of like the 1980s yuppie aesthetic and lifestyle. Right. But of course, he has this kind of double life where he murders people, especially women, any kind of stereotype you can imagine of the kind of this classic serial killer Patrick Bateman does. Now, of course, this movie is kind of typically taken, I don't know how to describe it generically. Is it a horror comedy? Is it a satire, as it sometimes is taken? Is it a horror movie? Is it a tragedy, a drama? I think I'll get into that a little bit later after I ask for you guys' reactions. The main element I would emphasize, honestly, is comedy, but I realize it's much more complicated than that. Yet, I think the kind of most salient thing that we can say about the movie, I'll just front load the kind of interpretation right now. Obviously, people think about it, and certainly, based on the novel by Bret Easton Ellis, right? Bret Easton Ellis has said as much as basically that he wrote this in 1991 as a kind of a reaction to where he felt like the kind of modern culture was heading, this kind of conformist, yuppie culture. The movie, kind of the most sort of salient moment the movie does this is when Patrick Bateman gives his speech about the Huey Lewis and the News song, Hip to Be Square, right? This kind of newly conformist, kind of the conformist culture of the 1980s based on excess and consumption and capitalism, right? Of the Reagan world, right? Obviously a theme we've kind of covered on for many movies in our podcast. And that, of course, somehow maybe like Patrick Bateman's behavior is kind of symbolic, or his commentary, some kind of satire or grotesque exaggeration of that life. So anyway, that's kind of a typical interpretation. I hope we can build on that a little bit further as we go. But I want to hear your guys' reactions. I presume this is such kind of a classic dorm room film. You've all seen it before, but I don't know that for a fact. Please let me know whether you've seen this movie before and what is your reaction upon watching it this time. Let's start with, how about Kirk first?
Sure. Thank you, Connor, for some, place setting and kind of sowing the seeds of conversation. I've always liked American Psycho. I feel like it's a good bridge for folks who maybe see movies as kind of this passing leisurely activity and they don't really think of it critically, but this movie kind of draws a very casual crowd in, and then I think it forces them to kind of confront some psychological, ideas, precepts that might be uncomfortable to explore. Maybe they're just along for the ride and the blood and gore and viscera. But for me, at least when I saw it for, the first time, I think I was in my early 20s, and I was starting to have a different perspective of cinema and art and kind of the intoxicating process of finding meaning in media as opposed to merely consuming it kind of offhandedly, compulsively. So I think it's a good choice. It is kind of hard to pin it down in terms of how you would categorize it. It's definitely a movie that can draw out some interesting feelings, can provoke pontification. For me, I think I can relate to, I think the idea is that we all have some of Patrick Bateman in us as active members of a postmodern America. It's innate. It's kind of, I think the idea is that it's inevitable, and that there is, at times, I guess there's kind of some dubious considerations about whether or not there is any real agency to adjust our course, that we're charting, at both as individuals and as a larger society. I think the first idea is that we struggle to acknowledge these social ills or these psychosocial phenomena. So I think that's what the movie is really. It's about acknowledging. It's about looking inward, on a micro and a macro scale. And as far as like getting away from the thematics, I find this movie, and I think this speaks a lot to its purpose or its construction, I guess, and its overall tone. But I find the first half of this movie to be much more engaging than the second. I think the second is just kind of like this, deep, I would say, like submerged descent into psychosis, and it's kind of off-putting at times, and obviously purposefully so. But the first half, I think we're drawn in by like his routines and his ability to kind of cruise throughout the city and utilize all these resources that are just exclusively for the rich and powerful. And so in a sense, it feels like we're kind of rubbing shoulders. It's almost that there's that natural draw that, I think distinguishes like a Bourne movie from a traditional action movie, is that Jason Bourne knows how to do everything in any situation. And I think you get a little bit of that like flavor with Patrick Bateman. He's so adept at navigating his way through this type of society, which feels so exciting and elegant and extravagant. So I was drawn in by that kind of initial luster, and then you're left with very much a hollow shell. And I think that's the idea. So, there's almost a mirror there. And what is essentially separating me from Patrick Bateman is it the fact that I'm not compelled to engage in senseless violence? Like, is that what turns me off to sort of relating to him or enjoying his story, I guess? I'm not sure, and if that's all that I find objectionable about his behavior, then perhaps there's even a deeper problem, right? Because the violence is so on the nose, but there are other aspects to it that I think might go overlooked by some of the frat crowd and some people who are just kind of casually viewing it. But anyways, I've taken up enough time. It's a great film. Christian Bale really, really, really crushes this one. I can't imagine this working to this effect, this film working this way with many other actors, probably a handful of actors. So really great.
Kirk, thank you so much. So many like really astute points. Not just like, okay, the first thing that it's a bridge. That's such a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but it is really like such a great movie, and great movie that we're watching for the podcast, because I think it's a movie that we all kind of met at a certain point in our film going like lives, and well, I'll hear from the others too. But anyway, there's so much that I want to get into about what Kirk said. I hope we can return to a lot of that. And also the idea of like, do we empathize with or do we look up to Patrick Bateman? Really interesting question. I think we should definitely get into that. And what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to hear from Anthony next.
Before I begin, Kirk, where do you consider the second half of the movie? Is it like the chainsaw, or is there like the literal time moment for you?
It almost feels like it's like the first act, I guess, after Paul Allen is killed. Which, by the way, Jared Leto, I think he has second billing in this film, and he's in it for a total of like 8 minutes. It's really strange. But yeah, after that, I kind of want to learn more about Paul Allen. He's more interesting than Patrick Bateman. But anyways.
And I was just curious. Okay, so I haven't seen it since I think freshman year of Goddard. So it's been what? Oh my God, 6 years, 6.5. So 6.5 years since the last time I've seen it, and I think what we're dealing with, whether it's the book or the film, are both going for it. And the way I kind of view it is a sort of moral tale, and a morality in a sense of an amoral world that's completely overtaken by a kind of consumerist impulse. And thematically, what I think we're left with is the kind of ridiculousness of that compulsion run extreme, probably most famously evident in the card scene when they have to pinpoint every little detail that just seems so arbitrary and kind of ridiculous that you can't help but kind of laugh. And the way it kind of seeps out into the kind of minimalist cold apartments that they all go to, these restaurants that seem to have so much character and interest and yet are devoid of any kind of warmth, similar to the Friends, right? The ultimate conformity marked by consumption, suits everywhere. You can't even really tell some of these people apart. The characters can't even tell each other apart. They mix each other up all the time. And I think Bateman even says, he understands it, because the only real difference is that unless you look closely, you could get a little difference of haircut. And so I think what we have is what, maybe the Wolf of Wall Street or Goodfellas wants to do, is give us a character we're meant to feel utterly repulsed by. And of course, at least the Wolf of Wall Street really has a kind of real man to anchor it. Here, we're given a complete fictional take and shown that level of extremity at its kind of most immoral, corrupt form. Literally someone who dreams or doesn't, who actually carries out, depending on your interpretation, I suppose, death, murder, violence against, others, female coworkers, the kind of unfortunate of society. And so that's all kind of running at its core. Now, I think why I was asking Kirk where he finds the second act to begin is I tend to kind of actually agree with him. I find the first part much more fascinating than I do the second half, which for me kind of comes, I guess, after the Paul Allen or even the chainsaw kind of infamous moment. Something about the movie kind of loses itself. And on this rewatch, what I would think I'd have to say for it is, the first time I saw this, I didn't really actually care for it. I always felt kind of indifferent about it. And the second time, I find something about it kind of stayed in the sense of, it comes out in 2000, yet I feel like so much of this movie is meant for clips on like TikTok or like Instagram video, like these 30 seconds to a minute and a half, like highlight reels. And they feel so devoid of style because that's the purpose of, Mary Hearn's direction, that I don't really feel sometimes like the laughs emerge the way they should. And I don't always feel like the uncomfortability hits me the way it should either. And what I think we have is a really good Tom Cruise impersonation that I find much more impactful and significant than what the rest of the movie wants to add up to. And so what I'm left ultimately with is a really wonderful performance and a really interesting core and attempt at telling this kind of anti-80s or pro in a weird way, this kind of difficult 80s kind of Wall Street tale that I think just kind of feels by the end unsolved in a weird way. I don't know how else to put it. So I kind of, I'm throwing out a bunch of things. Maybe it didn't make sense at all, but I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm getting a little nervous because we have another whole ocean to plumb here. A lot of things that Anthony said and really interesting. I'm curious, can I ask for a little clarification, Anthony? Just about like what you meant by those 30-second clips. You feel like there's disconnect kind of comic skits like the card scene, for example. Like give me another example of what you mean.
Yeah, I feel like the skits, I feel like they are skits in a way. And I feel like they're kind of like a series of skits that don't necessarily add up to what should be heading us in that direction of the second half or the second act and the third act. I'd say not the card scene itself, but I'd say probably the part where he hires the two girls to go to Paul Allen's apartment and films himself. I'd say even the workout and the spa moment feels like this. These kind of famous clips now that have been parodied actually to death in a way, whether it's Margot Robbie or Kanye West, who had an ad for that a few years ago. So those are the kind of moments I'm thinking about.
I think there's definitely that's really interesting. I agree that it can feel like skits. I'll talk about that a little bit when we're all done. But now we have to hear Tony's take. TM, let's go.
Thank you for the intro here. Yeah, so I saw this in college. I kind of similar to Anthony. I saw it, I think, around the same time, probably early college. Then I saw it again very recently, actually, like last month. And now, so this is my third time seeing it. And yeah, it's a really interesting movie because it is this sort of, as Connor said, a dorm room classic. It's very much like a cult classic. It's an extremely iconic movie. Like this is one of the most like memed movies like ever. Like there's something about it that is just so iconic. There's just like the Christian Bale performance, which is legitimately like one of the best performances I've ever seen. Just the kind of the way he smiles, the way all his expressions are like just amazing. The way he absolutely just inhabits this character, this like complete like vacant and completely like all surface level emotions is really like uncanny and remarkable. I think it's probably still his best performance. And I think that contributes to that sense of being like iconic, like those scenes, like obviously the Huey Lewis in the News scene, the business card scene, everything like that. And there's just so many great little moments of dialogue, so many great little interactions that are really funny. But like, yeah, the interesting thing about it is like this movie is pretty widespread and pretty popular, but it's almost odd that it is because there's things about it that really hold you at a distance. I think one is the fact that, like Anthony said, like it does feel kind of like a series of vignettes. There is no real plot here. There is no real sense of like narrative propulsion or momentum. It's just kind of Patrick Bateman going through his life, going to various dinners, going on dates, hiring sex workers, returning videotape. We don't actually see him return videotapes, although he mentions it multiple times. And all these things just kind of happen and they never accumulate. The closest thing we get to an ongoing thread is the investigation of Paul Allen's murder, which of course doesn't go anywhere, right? So it's kind of a shambling, kind of plotless movie. And also like the movie is so cold and really holds you at a distance, like to compare it to something like Wolf of Wall Street. Part of the point of Wolf of Wall Street is to present this lifestyle in a very like alluring way, right? It's presented in a way where you see kind of the appeal of it before it shows you why it is in fact bad or why these people are bad, right? That's kind of the turn. And that's like the Scorsese move. But here, I don't think the movie ever presents it as appealing. I mean, everything is so cold. You see them at all these restaurants, but you see food occasionally, but it's never something that looks good. It's never photographed in an appealing way. You never see people eating food and enjoying it. You never really see people like take pleasure in this movie. It's all symbolic. It's all the conspicuous consumption. You're going to Dorsia because that's the place people like you go. It signals your elitism, your status. It's not a place you actually desire to eat food at, right? And when he takes what's the name of the woman who's his friend's fiance to dinner?
Courtney.
Okay, so when he takes Courtney to dinner and she wants to go to Dorsia and he basically lies to her that they are at Dorsia, it's because he knows someone in her class position isn't going to know the difference. So for him, he can afford to go there, essentially, is what it is, right? So this movie in some ways kind of does leave me cold. I mean, I admire it a lot. I admire its commitment to its own coldness, its commitment to this kind of extreme satire of this milieu, this culture. And I think that it does also lose me, maybe not halfway through, But towards the very end, when the movie kind of makes its turn, where it kind of reveals that this is perhaps all in Bateman's head, I have no issue with it being in Bateman's head. I think that I like the ambiguity of it, but I kind of wish the movie had let us come to that conclusion on our own rather than just kind of throw it in our faces like that. As well as the scene where he's like shooting at the police and the cop car blows up. The tone is just so different than everything that's come before, and it doesn't really seem to be set up, unless I'm missing something, but it doesn't really seem to be set up particularly well. I prefer the version of the movie that just stays with what it was up to that point and commits to that as him. No, Patrick Bateman is the serial killer, and maybe plants little hints throughout that it is not in fact real, which are already in there. I mean, you have just the way like characters are constantly mishearing him. You know, he says murders and executions when he means mergers and acquisitions and so forth. The mishearing, the different names, he's going by different names at different times, the interchangeability of identity, the fact that none of these people are even human beings. They're just a collection of consumer choices. And I think basically that's what the movie's getting at, is like, in this culture, in this world, you know, we have this violence going on, you know, overseas. We have the reference to Iran-Contra at the end of the movie, a violence that sustains these lifestyles, a violence that everyone kind of acquiesces to and is aware of, but kind of suppresses their knowledge of, so they can continue going to nice restaurants and playing on their expensive stereo systems and so forth. And just the only room in there, the only room for identity or expression is in these sort of consumer choices. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's the parts of this movie I really, really like. I think there's a lot of great moments, but I feel like on the whole, I wonder if it could have, I don't know, it could have been done in like a kind of a smoother way, maybe with another rewrite or something. But yeah, it was a little rambling, but those are my general thoughts on it.
No, Tony, thank you. And again, like, my head is spinning. I try to kind of plan out where I thought, you know, we might go, and I have some ideas for directions to go. I think just 2 points I want to highlight for now. Everyone mentioned the second half of the movie, which leads into the whole question of like, is this all a dream? It's apparently pretty ambiguous. The characters don't accept the fact that Patrick Bateman has killed these people. There's no evidence that they were ever killed. It's as if he may have dreamed it, right? Things start to get more heightened towards the end. Right. It seems like maybe this could have just been his fantasy the whole time, is kind of one typical reading of it. Some people think too that it's like, it's not a fantasy, but somehow it's just that the society can somehow allow him to get away with it. They can't accept that he could ever do this because he plays the part so well. Right. So that's a really interesting question. I want to come back to that too, but whether that even matters. But okay, then there's one other thing, that there was a difference among the three of you, which was a question of like, are we allured by Patrick Bateman's life? And do we kind of look up to Patrick Bateman in any way? Now, I will tell you that, okay, that maybe this is a straw man, right? The idea that anyone would like sympathize with Patrick Bateman. I don't mean on the level of like his deep psychology and his issues, but just the idea of like, obviously we understand that Bateman in some ways plays, you know, his life to the fullest, right? Or he plays it up. He's kind of looks like an alien, but he performs this wealthy man persona well, in a way, right? And I have heard of people who like unironically like look up to Patrick Bateman, or like find some way of identifying with Patrick Bateman. And I think there's more to it than you think. Obviously, one easy way of saying that would be just like, this is toxic men, right? Like, and that is kind of part of it. But anyway, but one thing I want to get into, and how do we think about Patrick Bateman? How do we think about this movie? And again, a thing that Anthony mentioned, this idea of the skits, the comic skits. So I want to go back to this idea mentioned at the beginning of the genre of the movie. So we can say of the book, right, that it's in kind of an old genre of what I would call, okay, the Diary of a Madman. I'm comparing it to the Gogol story, Diary of a Madman, right? This idea of this insane character who has a confession of some kind. Usually it's like we set up kind of like the way that he thinks, and then something kind of strange happens, and somehow his madness is revealed or not revealed. And then something happens, and like his situation doesn't completely change, but something has been revealed about society in the process because somehow like the madman is all of us and stuff like that. It's like kind of a genre that exists. I think I would compare it to like Notes from Underground, which was my favorite book of all time. So I'm like gravitate towards that genre. I haven't read the book American Psycho, by the way. But what I think is interesting, what a lot of people pointed out, is that the Bret Easton Ellis novel goes into all of these like gory details, right? And it consists of a lot of monologues, I believe, along the lines of what we hear from Patrick Bateman when he talks about Huey Lewis in the news, right? The kind of the content of his mind and the kind of empty sort of like consumeristic nonsense that fills his mind, right? Combined with like these moments of like hyper violence. So of course, like this was something that I guess you could have filmed, but you can't film his interior monologue. We do get an interior monologue, but I think one salient point is the way that Mary Harron adapted this story. And the way I would put it is she changed the genre. It's no longer the Diary of a Madman story where we're kind of fascinated with and pulled into this character, kind of repulsed, kind of identifying with him. We're instead getting this character who, and I think the genre is comedy, but it's a character-driven comedy. To me, this movie is up there with like Zoolander and the way that it can make me laugh. Like the strength of the character of Patrick Bateman, knowing how he's going to react in any situation, the absurdity of his character, that he is kind of robotic and he can barely make it happen, that when he sees a business card that's better than his, he starts to like, you can hear his voice crack and he starts to cry. There's something very funny about this. And I think that's part of the appeal. And that's part of the dark humor that has hooked people about this movie and has drawn people to the Patrick Bateman character. Also, not because he's perfect. I mean, he kind of has a sort of like way of getting through it all, but he kind of squirms in the process as well. And like, we can feel like he's about to break, but people don't seem to see that he's breaking, right? So I think like you have to understand this. And I think you can see this in the moment, like where he's going to kill Paul Allen. It turns into like a Jim Carrey-esque like performance. You know, it's totally over the top. He's shuffling and sliding around on the floor. He's doing the robot. There's something about that. And of course, that again is kind of a meta thing. So we get a lot of distance on Patrick Bateman, right? He becomes this kind of like comedy figure. Okay. And at the same time, we also break point of view at moments, which we don't get in the book. Theoretically, I don't know. I didn't read it, but I think you don't break point of view in the book. Whereas in this film, and this is the thing, this is not my opinion. This is not my like grand reading, by the way. I'm kind of repeating things that other people pointed out, you know, kind of the basic salient facts about Mary Harron's adaptation of the story. That she cut out a lot of the violence, right? Partially because you couldn't show it. Things are alluded to. We know that he beat up these prostitutes, that both of the prostitutes that he hired, but it's sort of alluded to in this very dark way where we only see them leaving his apartment with like bloodied faces. And, you know, obviously something very gruesome happened that we weren't shown, which makes it kind of more awful in its way. So we never break point of view, except, right, we follow Patrick Bateman pretty much throughout the whole movie. Even in the scenes with Willem Dafoe, who we could see as being kind of like a counterpart to Patrick Bateman, right? We never see him and we never get to see his perspective. We never see him leave the room and say, I think Patrick Bateman did it, or I don't think Patrick Bateman did it, right? That character is still, we only see him through Patrick Bateman's perspective. However, we do break point of view with two characters, the secretary character and with the prostitute character who he's about to kill, right? Christy. People have pointed out that this is like sort of like, again, getting a kind of distance on Bateman, right? And these are also the moments where, and here's where I say that my reading kind of breaks down, right? I've been kind of trying to say that this movie is like so much more comical than we even recognize. But it's at those moments, I have to say that watching it again, the humor of it totally sinks for me. Like, even though I got a lot of laughs, of course, in the first part of the movie, first maybe, you know, half hour, when you get to those scenes of both of those characters, you get this kind of distance on them. That creates this something that's much more than just the kind of comedy, right? So I have to kind of like back away from what I thought my original reading is. So I'm left with kind of like, I still don't know how to completely describe this movie. But anyway, that's kind of like the sort of the spiel that I prepared. And I think it's very interesting. I think there's more to be said on that point, but I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on any of that stuff.
Wait, did you choose Zoolander on purpose, Connor? Because there's a connection here.
What's the connection, Anthony?
So the connection is that Bret Easton Ellis actually sued Ben Stiller for plagiarizing his book Glamorama, which is a comedy and satire book about supermodels who get co-opted as terrorists. They settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, and to this day, Brett supposedly received some amount of royalty and money for that movie. So I thought it was kind of a curious connection there, that you picked of all the comedies that this relates to.
Yeah,
one
so
that
it
has
kind of falsifies my thesis a little bit, because then it's like I picked another Bret Easton Ellis character to compare this against, to say that she's rescued it from. Anyway, yeah, that's super interesting. But okay, that being said, if no one has anything to say on those points, the theme of the genre of the movie, the humor of it, if you also were taken with the humor, if you thought of it as a comedy, does it feel more of a horror to you? Anyway, the other thing that I would ask is, I'm directing it kind of to Tony. Anyone can take it, though. How much does it matter that we believe it's in his head or not? What more can we say about this ending?
Yeah, so I think the reason I dislike that the movie implies that it's in his head is because I think that, like, the satirical point of the movie, the point of satire, is to present an exaggerated version of something real that we can recognize in our own lives or in the lives of people in our society, whatever, right? So, like, if you just say, oh, he's just this, because they have the scene where he's speaking to his lawyer, which I actually like that scene, like, out of context. I think it's a good scene. It's interesting to see Bateman in this kind of different mode. He's kind of like desperate and unsure of himself in a way we haven't seen, and Christian Bale plays it very well. And that conversation is very tense. It almost reminds me of like the bathroom scene in The Shining, or like that scene in Lost Highway with the famous scene where the guy's calling him on the phone or something. There's just this intensity to that conversation and this surrealism to it that I really enjoy. However, I don't like it so much in the context of the movie because it's part of this segment I don't really like. But part of the reason I like it is because, to me, it's like the satire is that, like, on some deep level, right, that these people in the world, these stockbrokers, these people in this class position, right, people who go to these restaurants, people who do the things that Patrick Bateman does, maybe except for the killing, have something in common with him. That this appetite for violence, or this kind of casual sociopathy, maybe not the appetite for violence in itself, but this kind of like the emptiness, the lack of human connection, the transactional nature of all their relationships, that these things are things that are true of these people, that are also, these are traits that are also shared by, like, serial killers. It's commonly known that sociopaths often are very successful in the business world, right? This is almost a cliche to point this out, right? So it's not a super original point, perhaps, but whatever, there it is. If you make it that, oh, he's actually not a serial killer, he's just this, what's the line? He calls him a boring, spineless lightweight. He's just this guy who's kind of maybe even nerdy, perhaps, and this is like some sort of power fantasy. I don't know. I think it undermines kind of the satirical point a little bit. If you're saying, well, he's just someone who wants to be a serial killer. It's like, okay, well, I mean, yeah, isn't that the whole point? Like, Patrick Bateman is not a real person. That's not to say there aren't people like Patrick Bateman who exist. But yeah, so I kind of don't like that it makes that connection explicit in that way. I would prefer it stay in that kind of heightened dream world. So does it matter for the point of the movie? I guess no. I guess it being in his head is just making it explicit that, like, he may not be an actual killer. These people out there, these Patrick Batemans, they may not be actual killers who've taken lives, but they would be if given the opportunity and the circumstances, right? But I feel like that's a conclusion we should come to as an audience. The movie shouldn't literally make it clear in the third act. So that's why I object to that term.
Yeah, and to me, it's important. We still should note that it is ambiguous. I mean, I think it heavily weighs in favor of the fact that it is kind of in his head, right? To use an example, just one little bit of trivia that I was reading about was that Willem Dafoe, in the scene where he meets with Bateman at the restaurant, he was asked to do 2 different takes, one where he really believes that Bateman did it and one where he doesn't, right? So, like, that we're given this thing where, from Bateman's perspective, he can't know whether they know or not. And it's this kind of agonizing thing of, like, he can't believe they don't know, right? Even though apparently it's not true that he did this, but he really believes that he did. And I think that's important. I think we just have to accept that as that's the perspective the movie wants us to take I think people get a little bit too sidetracked and like, well, did it actually happen or did it not? I think, to Tony's point, like the satirical points or the social points kind of still stand either way. But I think to me, there's something like very, very important about that second act turn. I think it happens with the character whose name I forgot, the secretary character, Jean. We get this slight change, right, where he's about to kill her, then he doesn't. Right. I mean, this is kind of a story of him having kind of growing a little bit of a conscience. I mean, obviously, he's still psychopathic and crazy. He's still Patrick Bateman, but the cognitive dissonance of his life seems to kind of like escalate, right, with leading to him cracking and kind of breaking down in a lot of ways, and then his reality itself kind of breaking down, right, and leading, I think, the climax is that scene where he confesses, right, and that is that, as Tony mentioned, it feels good on its own, but to me, it feels good because it is that kind of cathartic moment of like, we see a little bit of humanity. We see his kind of relief. So to me, like, I almost think it's like his killing is kind of a manifestation of his guilt, right? Or even if it is in his head, maybe he would do these things, but it's also a manifestation of his guilt about maybe who he is and the psychopathy of the world he lives in, right? And that it's kind of expressed in this way. But there's something very powerful and very poignant to me about that idea of him confessing and not being believed. He wants to be sent away. He wants to be caught, and no one will indict him. And I think the point to be made there is deeper than just this time and place, though. I don't know. I think it's kind of along the lines of what Kirk was saying. I don't know if you want to jump in here, Kirk. I think there's more applicability to the Patrick Bateman character than just 80 stockbrokers.
Sure, definitely. I guess while you were talking, I was thinking about, what are the implications of the story if this is all imaginal? I guess, yeah, it's kind of like the idea that Tony broached about, like, well, somebody with the capacity to imagine this, to obsess over it, to write about it or draw it out, that's something that's cross-referenced by another person, that his date book is, his secretary finds his date book filled with gory drawings, and so I think we're meant to condemn him regardless. I don't think that his psychopathy is necessarily something that can allow him to escape any sense of culpability for these actions, thoughts, ideas, whatever. For me, I actually prefer the idea that he has killed somebody, and the movie just, I think, like Tony, I think there's more stakes in that sense. But either way, I think the message is clear that we have been, as an American society, we have been conditioned to consume, and when that is not enough, we will turn the intensity knob up to 11, through, I guess, I don't know if it's a moralistic point, but just kind of like a sociological one, like through licentiousness and through indiscriminate violence, and that becomes a way to consume, that becomes a way to connect, right? I think Patrick Bateman's greatest sin is that he's never allowed himself to feel vulnerable, and I think he copes with his insecurities by believing that he's incapable of emotion. I think he is capable of emotion. Yeah, I think he's kind of all of us, overly insecure, insular, but a strong guiding desire to conform. This is continued on. Yeah, there's really not much. If anything, our society's become more exaggerated, except obviously more dispersed, sequestered, but there isn't necessarily this kind of paragon of success, but in the Wall Street sense, that's kind of played out. But the driving force of clicks, of views, of consuming other people, of becoming an entity, becoming an influencer, becoming somebody who can create jealousy in others. I think that's an intoxicating power, right? So I think this movie applies. And as somebody who's experienced, like, moments of derealization throughout my life. I found some moments to be rather poignant, certainly. Like just the idea that you almost, you feel like an actor, right? And I think this is we're meant to feel like watching Patrick. We're meant to feel that he is acting constantly and he's learning and he's adapting. He's like an AI chat machine, right? And he's conditioned to say the things that are appropriate in each given context. And it's kind of really sad. And my favorite moment is probably with the secretary when she asks him if he's ever wanted to make somebody else happy, and he gives some kind of stock response about fulfilling relationship, right? Just something he read on a Hallmark card, but that seemed like the closest he could possibly get to coming to terms with what he's done, imaginal or otherwise, and I guess just who he is as a person outside of the gratuitous violence. So I don't know if there's anything there. It's a moving movie for me. It does grab me because I think it speaks to all of us. I don't know. Maybe I'm just one of the inflicted, but I definitely relate to some elements of this persona.
Kirk, I have to say, I just made a reservation at a restaurant the other day, and I could visualize the satellite antenna like going up like outside of my phone. Like somehow, like there's moments of like do feel like I'm this Patrick Bateman-esque character in my life. I guess it's because of like when I feel like I'm acting or pretending or doing something, like I guess I get this kind of distance from my own life. That like, and somehow Patrick Bateman as a character, obviously not a character to look up to, but somehow he kind of like he embodies that for me. But obviously, watching this movie again, having that in mind, I mean, I was going to play this as like he's such a funny character for that reason. He's such almost like a cathartically farcical character. What it made me think is like, well, like maybe I really shouldn't have that feeling. Maybe that's like a really bad sign. Maybe I should not visualize that I have a satellite phone when I'm making reservations at Dorsia. So I had another question, which was that does it fit into its time? But anyway, you can choose to answer that in your final review. I think I'll start with Anthony, who I wanted to ask. Is that okay, Anthony, if I ask you? You don't have to answer the question. You can just give your final take on the movie, and then we can move on to the suggestion section.
Thinking about it, I going back, I really like this idea of the wanting to confess but being unable to, or being unheard, which is sort of an inverse, I guess, on the kind of Kafka story or kind of Kafka thematic there. I also like the way Kirk thinks about it in connection to our presentations of influencing and influencer. I think the one stopgap there that separates this story from the kind of contemporary, though, is, and this is a problem I have with the movie, is all of the presentation of excess and showmanship is for Patrick's inner clique. It's for the guys at the office. It's the cards. It's the presentation of the cards. It's the suits. It's recognizing the suits. Whereas I feel like today that would also be shown outward. It would be presented to everybody. It would be something that you want everybody to see, or at least as many people to reach as possible, and not just a small little group. And this goes back to something I was thinking with, Tony, and talking about the kind of annoyance at the movie kind of spoon feeding us the dream or real reality kind of question of the murders. Is overall, like, this movie, we're already in the dream world from like the beginning. And I feel like this is a movie that's as stylized as like Terry Gilliam's Brazil or Richard Ayoade's like The Double in its own way. Like the New York that we see is not interesting. It's a cold inner New York. The outer side of New York is as cold and drab of detail as the restaurants. And it's as drab as the home and as drab as the office. There's no like separation of where this is kind of interesting or where this could be different. And so what we're left from the very beginning is kind of like, is this anything to kind of bring into our lives other than his character, other than his identity? And so I guess we have these fantasies of acting and these fantasies of wanting to kill our boss, the kind of common American trope there, I guess. And it just kind of feels, I mean, at least to me, and this, I will get to my vote, it feels to me at least kind of flatlined in a weird way. Like I want almost at some point for this movie to give me a pulse. And I want to see why I would want this guy's life to begin with, who I should. Handsome Christian Bale, handsome, rich man with horrible music taste. But at all times, I just kind of get the flat line image of this reality. And so I see Kirk shaking the head. Well, that's my clue, I guess.
You don't like Whitney Houston? What is wrong with you?
Okay.
Studio.
Sussudio is a good track. I would stand by that.
Okay, there's some decent ones. We got to also mention John Cale doing the score, which is very interesting selection there. Anyway, I'll say soft no. Just, I get what it's going for. I find it interesting as a discussion piece, and I find it, like as Tony was saying at the beginning, fascinating how the movie's really taken off, and I wonder what cultural influences are behind it, whether it's the director, the writer, the material, the kind of post-Trump and Trump era, the musical that came out on Broadway in 2013 or whatever year it was. Anyway, so soft no. Sorry, Connor.
That's fine, Anthony. We'll have to have another spin-off series where we do the musicals of all the movies we watched. Not sure how many there are, but I want to hear from Kirk next.
Yeah, I mean, it's a yes for me. I can't imagine voting no in my shoes. Like, I'm not kind of equivocating. I think, or vacillating is the word I want to use. But I love the movie. I think it's great. There's a little touch. Whenever I'm watching a film, especially that's set in New York, I'm uniquely attuned to like the skyscrapers, the skyline. So he works obviously in the financial district. Some of the backdrops that they use for his office, I think, are purposefully horrible. Like they're what you would see in like, a junior high rendition of something like How to Succeed in Business. It's just horrible. It's not even an attempt. I think that kind of adds to the surreal aspect of it. Also, just kind of the alleyways. There's always it's kind of like somebody's idea of New York who hasn't been to New York, right? Like that's kind of how it felt at times. I know that's a cliched statement, but anyways, it's a yes for me. Yeah, I think there's a lot to consider, and I think that the movie, asks us to be brave enough to really let some of these ideas, whatever they may be, seep in and kind of swish them around in our mouths and, either accommodate or assimilate the ideas as necessary. But to me, it feels like a piercing film. Like it's a very it's not necessarily that all like consuming where you jump in a pool, right, and you're submerged, but it's like this needle that's like stuck right in your carotid. Like I can feel it. It's very precise and effective. So I'll give it a yes.
Kirk, thank you. And I yes. So it finds its way into the culture. Is why it's so memeable. Whenever if anyone gives me a business card, I will like audibly quote the movie. Like, you know what I mean? It's so
the
iconic.
Tasteful thickness of it.
Yeah. And so Tony, bring us home. Where are you going to land on this
wow.
one? You're a little bit on the fence.
I've got a power. I'm feeling the Patrick Bateman power trip right now. I truly feel like him in this moment as I wield this incredible power. And the movie American Psycho is Pal Allen on the couch, and we're listening to, I guess, 100 gecs, and I'm pontificating about their synthetic, abrasive bubblegum concoctions that say so much about our, post-Trump America or something. Anyway, yeah, what you guys are saying about New York and the way the movie depicts New York, I think it's such a great point. It is such a weird, almost like fake, bad depiction of New York in a way that I almost think this would be a really interesting double feature with Eyes Wide Shut, which also has this very 2D kind of depiction of New York City, and is also very kind of dreamlike and almost like a fantasy. So and it came out right around the same time, so I think that would be a very interesting double feature, but I digress. See, I really feel a lot of what Anthony's saying here, and that I do feel like now, having seen this movie 3 times and having discussed it with you guys, that for me, there's something that makes it not 100% successful. Like that, I feel like it doesn't quite come all the way home. It feels, I don't know, compromised in certain ways. I don't know. I wish it had really committed to one of the things it was going for, I guess, and as I said, I don't love the third act. But at the same time, I think there's a reason this movie has endured. I think that the high points are so just memorable and so interesting. I think Christian Bale is incredible. I think that there's just something about this movie that just like sticks with you and like that you just remember, and that is kind of powerful and haunting even. I think it is like sort of this thing where even if, yeah, like sure, it's about these stockbrokers, but yes, I do think it applies to us today and to other contexts. And yeah, I think this is a movie that people are going to continue watching for, decades to come. I think there is something about it that is important and that is powerful. And despite my reservations, like my gut, I got to go with my gut. My gut says it's got to be a yes. So I'm gonna vote yes, American Psycho.
Thank you, Tony. It is interesting to think about. I mean, so that was kind of a soft yes. It barely makes it in. It squeezes by, but it's in. American Psycho's in the 706. I'm happy about that. Yes, very iconic movie. Yeah, there's more to think about, especially about the structural things we mentioned. And I think there's still more to be said about this movie. Certainly on the thematic level, there is. I'll leave you just with a quote. I like to have a quote or a favorite moment. Again, very, very hashtag relatable. Patrick Bateman enters his office for the first time. He talks to Jean, the secretary. He tells her, maybe wear a skirt next time, Jean. She's like, okay, Patrick. And then she leaves. And then he sits authoritatively down at his desk. He presses a button and we just hear from off screen something about the frigate birds or something. He just immediately is watching a YouTube video at his desk. Something about that and the perfect timing to that too, as we hear that he's definitely watching something about frigate birds. And
it was Jeopardy. It was a Jeopardy question.
Oh, is it a Jeopardy question?
Yeah.
Okay, he's watching Jeopardy. Okay. Dang. Okay, I thought it was like a nature documentary. That's what I wanted to imagine. But okay. Anyway, that was my moment. There are many other moments. Guys, let's move on now to the fan favorite segment, the first of the new year. Happy New Year, everyone. By the way, I forgot to say. You guys recommend a movie and I get to choose which one we're going to watch for next time. Now you have to choose one. We'll go in the order of the least recent person and the person who least recently got a movie in to be reviewed on the podcast. And of course, remember the old Kirk protocol. You cannot have a movie from the same decade as one already suggested. So who went least recently? I don't remember.
I think
it was Anthony.
Yeah.
Okay, Anthony. So you decide the order.
Okay. So I'm going to go second. I'm going to have Tony go first and Kirk go last.
The thinking man's choice. Very good. Okay. Tony.
All right. You've put me on the spot, but that's okay. That's okay. I'm gonna commit to it. So this was gonna be more of a Kirk pick, but this is the most recent movie I saw that I was like, oh, this would be good for the podcast. I'm gonna go with a 2015 drama called Mississippi Grind, starring Ben Mendelsohn and Ryan Reynolds. This is about two men. It's kind of a road movie. And one of them is a gambling addict, and the other one is sort of a kind of a drifter who's very charismatic. So Ben Mendelsohn plays the gambling addict. Ryan Reynolds plays this kind of charismatic drifter who kind of goes from town to town, having experiences, kind of meeting people, kind of a mysterious figure. And they kind of form this bond and basically go south. I'm very bad. Kirk's rolling in his grave right now because I don't know any locations at all. It is not actually set in Mississippi, but they go basically state to state, gambling, in casinos, on horse races, and on everything. And as the movie progresses, we learn more about these two men and their lives. And it's extremely entertaining. It's extremely funny. It's at times extremely sad. I think it's a movie that is like kind of like better than you think it's going to be when it starts, if that makes sense. It kind of like has like a feel of like, oh, it's like a buddy comedy, it's a road movie, but there are moments and there are scenes that had kind of a depth and profundity that kind of took me aback when I watched the movie. And I just really, really enjoyed it. And it's also kind of underseen. I feel like I don't really hear people talk about it. So that's my recommendation.
Mississippi Grind. Okay, let's hear from Anthony.
What year was that, Tony?
2015.
2015. Okay, so I'm not even anywhere close. Just wanted to make sure. I'm in the 1970s, 1975 to be specific. And I actually nominated one of this guy's films last time, I believe, Being There. But I'm going to do a different one this time. It's Hell Ashby again, who I absolutely love and care about. I don't know if you've seen his stuff or how much of his stuff you've seen, but what I want to nominate is Shampoo, starring Warren Beatty, Julie Christie, Carrie Fisher, and Goldie Hawn. And so what the film is about is Warren Beatty plays a kind of hairdresser who kind of gets himself in trouble with the different girls he's kind of playing on the side. It's set against the kind of election of Nixon to office, the second term. And what we get is, instead of a kind of just cynical satire of this era, a really sad look and a really humorous look at the kind of sexual revolution as it's happening. A really disparate way of thinking about this kind of time that we usually associate with great music, the parties and this kind of like swinger lifestyle. But instead, what I found is like a really like emotionally resonant movie that may be Warren Beatty's like best performance. And so it's a kind of cinephile pick in a way. It's a kind of classic pick, but I think it's worth discussing.
Shampoo. Very intriguing, Anthony. Okay. Hear from Kirk.
All right. So I guess I don't know, just thematically might be, interesting to offer up another like super genuine kind of turn of the century film in Castaway. Tom Hanks, Castaway. This is a film that like I remember distinctly when it came out. I saw it in theaters. I think I was 10 probably. And everybody loved it. Really, like kind of unironically, everybody really loved it. I don't know where it's gone, like how it's settled, like how it's sunk to the its residency, its status in terms of where it is in the cultural landscape in 2023. I think some people would look at it rather cynically, or maybe they think it's too broad. It's another Zemeckis kind of Forrest Gump sentimentality, right? But I think there's some interesting aspects, and certainly the acting. I mean, it doesn't really allow you to, or it doesn't subject you to too much tired kind of workings that filmmakers like Zemeckis like to use, or because it's such a solitary experience. So I think that's really interesting. It's like classic fish out of water survivor story type of film. So that's my choice.
Castaway it is. Guys, very interesting choices for this year of 2023. Of course, it is customary for me to explain or to say which movies I have seen and where I'm standing right now, and then before you guys rebut. Okay, obviously the standout here would be Shampoo, 1975, right? Right up my alley. I love being there. However, I've seen the film. Little does Anthony know, I remember when he recommended it last time, and I always watch the movies that Anthony recommends, even if they don't make it into the podcast. And I have to say, I was lukewarm. I didn't see what had captured Anthony's imagination. I wonder if he can spark me a little bit here, because he obviously is the standout. Castaway, I've never seen. I have to say, there's a little part of me turns up my nose a little bit. I will admit. But it could be amazing. Obviously, it's quoted and it's known and it's a classic. And I'm sure it's a good movie as well. So I should probably overcome my snobbishness. And as for Tony's, I don't know. Sounds interesting. Let's just say I hope Kirk can get some good rebuttals in here. Let's begin with Kirk.
Oh man, Into the Fire. So Tony, just for clarity, you said your movie goes south. I mean, is this movie north or south of the Mason-Dixon line? I just have to figure that out.
Honestly, Kirk, I don't know. I'm so
Okay,
bad with
okay.
geography.
No, it's just you sounded like a frontiersman. They went south. They went
Yeah,
south to
I don't even know if
Norway.
it's in the United States. They could be in Morocco for all I know. It's
Okay. Well, I just it's really hard for me to take Ryan Reynolds seriously. I don't think he's much of an actor. Sad to say, I haven't seen much to really be impressed by him. But it could be an interesting film. As for Shampoo, yeah, I'll trust Connor's assessment. It sounds interesting, to be honest. It could be good. And Connor, I think it comes down to the idea of like, would you rather watch that movie twice? Do you feel like you have enough to talk about upon a second rewatch? Would there be some sort of revelation, or I think it would be fascinating. I had figured all three of you had seen Castaway, so and maybe there's even more than just you, Connor, who haven't seen it. But it's one you got to see, and I think there is more to it than your typical. Like it certainly, yeah, it's kind of mawkish, right, at times. And I think that's in order to protect the wide audience that might see it. So it's kind of like a Cameronian type of tactic that he uses in all of his films, Avatar and Avatar 2 included. But just the acting, the showmanship, the certain level of flexibility and creativity and risk that's on display from Tom Hanks. This, I think, is his most well acted film, and I think he won the Oscar for it. If I'm not, I should know that, but if nothing else, we could just meme our way through an easy breezy podcast. But I think it would, out of these three, Castaway would be our best episode. That's what I will say, hands down. So,
Thank you, Kirk. Now, Anthony.
Yeah, so I mean, if you've seen the movie before, maybe you're right. Maybe there isn't something deeper or interesting for you a second time around. I will say, oh, and I had it wrong. It's the '68 election. And so one thing I find fascinating with Shampoo that maybe we could get really into is this is a movie that's already criticizing a nostalgia for the '60s. And it's doing so 5, 6, 7 years after it's kind of all over, which I think is really interesting. But one of the reasons I want to kind of present Tony's film, I've seen Castaway, but I think actually this kind of connects maybe with all three. But one of the reasons I really want to present it is to go back to the sort of movie where the kind of character can kind of understand the world's changing, can kind of understand the culture's changing, and that they really have no play and no influence in that world at all. But they understand that. And I find that a kind of really fascinating kind of way of thinking about the movie, not just because it's comical, not just because it's humorous and it's, kind of a legendary cast and written by Robert Towne, arguably the greatest screenplay writer of all time, for Chinatown, of course. But I think there may be something deeper there this time. It may be worth getting at, and maybe not. Maybe Tony's Birth of a Nation film is the way to go. That's all I have to say.
All right. Tony, the gauntlet's been thrown. Fight back.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have anything too much to say to distinguish it from the other two. I mean, it's recent. I guess I'd say that I think it's one that we'll all enjoy. I think it's like very solid. It's a very solid and very accessible movie. But I think that there's a lot in there. I think in terms of being about, depiction of addiction, certainly. I think the acting is across the board fantastic, as well as the depiction of just a friendship. And yeah, when I watched it resonated with me very powerfully. So all I'll say is it's very like solid for what it is. I think both the other ones sound good. I've never seen Castaway either, Kirk. So I guess not everyone saw it. But I was born in 2018, so what do I know?
I mean, this is another example of the difference that a few years makes. Because if you were my age, you certainly would have seen it. Your parents would have dragged you to the theater. So
I saw it from a Blockbuster rental. Forgot to throw that out.
All right, guys, you've left me high and dry. I'm at a loss. None of them cry out to be picked by me. Obviously, Shampoo seems like the one that in principle I should pick. now Castaway. It's sort of we've been thinking about, should we do more canonical movies that are, well, maybe not canonical but recognized or widely watched, right? Should we take a step in that direction? It worked out with Titanic, for example, a movie that I had no recollection of at all when I watched it again for this podcast. And then there's Tony's, which, like, I can tell, like, there's a heart in it. Like, it's just a movie that just spoke to Tony. He doesn't maybe have like a big like take about it. He doesn't like have like an angle, but he just sincerely enjoyed it and wants to share it. So, like, all of them have things that appeal. None of them are grabbing me completely, but guys, it popped into my head. I'm going to go with my guts, my instinct. Castaway. My instinct is Castaway. Something tells me it's going to be a good episode. We're going to have a great episode, in fact.
Oh, yes.
It's going to, it's a movie like I've never seen. I feel like stupid whenever like Wilson is mentioned and stuff. So, like, I should fill in this gap in my pop cultural knowledge. And maybe it's going to be a big joke and a meme. Maybe we'll have some interesting, like, maybe Tony will, criticize the writing and the pace. Maybe Anthony will, like, kind of break it down on like a, Marxist level. We'll see. But I think it could be quite interesting. So that's what we're going to watch for next time. Thank you all for a great episode. Let's have Anthony play us out.
I'll have what she's having.